Thank you, Prof. Munir. Now, finally, we have the U.S. perspective. Professor Marvin Weinbaum, from Professor Emeritus, University of Illinois, Scholar in Residence at the Middle East Institute, Washington. The floor is yours. Okay.
Thank you. Is this on? Is it on now? No. I'm going to be talking indeed about the American perspective on the Afghan transition process. And in doing so, it's going to be what I think is the American perspective, but obviously also what is my perspective of the American perspective. In a way, the disengagement began psychologically, if not yet quite physically, with the very announcement of the surge in December of '09. Because, as you recall, in the announcement, there was the observation that, of course, we would begin to reverse this in the end of 2011. And then later on, the Lisbon conference, the next year, better defined that and said, well, yes, but we would really see closure here at the end of 2014. That really set in motion here so much of the discussion that we're talking about with regard to a transition out, because the international community also, taking the cue from the United States, also began to think of its troop reductions and what it was going to be doing, because now we had, after the NATO meeting in Lisbon, we now had a firmer sense of a time perspective. So this transition here is welcomed by many Afghans who have been grown resentful of foreign troops and welcome a transfer of power, greater responsibility to their own leaders. There are those who understandably see an economy which has been distorted and individuals enriched in a way which naturally promotes resentment. But at the same time, and the same people, not a different set of people necessarily, a sense of unease and uncertainness about what's about to happen. Will we be ready to assume the responsibilities? Will our security forces be able to step up, as is implied here? Will conceivably, will ethnic divisions flare in its wake? Will they become even more combustible? What will be, and very importantly, what will be the economic impact? And can we keep the social gains? Well, in my paper here, and I'm just going to be skimming it, what I've done here is first to examine what I think is some of the American goals, and look particularly at three of the strategies. The strategy of reconciliation, the strategy which we've already been talking about, the strategy of the region, which we have talked about, and we've also mentioned here, but a separate set of strategies involve how we can deal with this economic issue, because it's a very severe one. More than 90% of what is available in the country has a foreign origin. How do you make this transition? Well, we'll come to that in a moment, maybe we'll do. What is the U.S. really, if it had to say, bottom line, does it expect? A minimally effective state. A state which is stable, a state which has a legitimate national government. It doesn't have to be a strong national government, but it's got to be a legitimate, ultimately, a national government. That's all Afghanistan ever really could aspire to. Delivering basic goods and services, able to defend itself, and for the United States and the others too, not unimportantly, that it not become again a breeding ground for Al-Qaeda and similar kinds of groups. Groups with a global agenda, regional and global agenda. In the process, the U.S. does wish to extend and preserve those areas which have seen progress, And so much rests on this security force, particularly on the Army, on its ability to act independently with greater effectiveness than it's shown to date, but also on the social side, that we not lose the gains and extend them, perhaps schooling, especially for women, girls. Very importantly, the gains in health, which we've not, did you mention this in your remarks? Very important here. If we look at some of those indices here of infant mortality, women's not surviving childbirth, these are really quite dramatic. And I think we should underestimate these. Also developing possible, where we've made some improvements in local level governance, administrative capacity, very mixed on this, in this development at the district level, and ultimately here a policy which buffers this decline in aid with building institutional capacities. Now, in order to see here, what the U.S. adopted was two surges, well, let me say three surges. A military surge, which we're quite familiar with, a civilian surge, and then a diplomatic surge. The first two are in the process of winding down. The third, on the other hand, is in full swing. I'm not going to talk about the troop drawdown. Ultimately, it's supposed to be the bulk of the forces out, but by the end of 2012, for example, 68,000 as against almost 100,000 right now. The question is, what is the slope here? Just how front-ended, back-ended is it going to be? And that may be condition-based. We would hope it would be condition-based. The responsibility is being handed over. As a companion piece to this, and not unimportantly, is the strategic agreement that the United States has been simultaneously working for, and in some ways seems to work against the grain of what the drawdown is. And that's the idea that militarily, but in other ways too, will still be around. Now, no one ever said in the transition process that come 2014, when the bulk, certainly of the international forces, was leaving, that at the same time, that was the end of economic assistance. No, it's always been understood that we're looking at a decade at least of considerable resources, assuming that they are made available. But at least that's the goal. A goal here so that they're not left abandoned, but also a goal, too, that there not be a power vacuum in Afghanistan that the neighboring countries would take advantage of, so that we would still have a presence, although at the same time we say we would have a presence, but we would not have permanent military bases here. Now, there's been very little progress, as you know, on this. Let me not say very little progress. There has been progress in the strategic agreement, but we've not reached an agreement. Some of you, we mentioned here some of the sticking points, the night raids, more importantly, what to do with the detained prisoners. There are other issues over equipment, some issues over local police. I'm not going to go into this. And one issue which nobody's talking about, and that is, in order to have this, ultimately you're going to have some kind of understanding, or more than that, probably something much more formalized on a status of forces agreement. Remember, that was the sticking point in Iraq, which led the United States to make a complete withdrawal. But they've deliberately kept it off the table right now. Now, the second surge is the civilian surge. About 1,000 or so have been were brought in, mainly from the State Department, some of the other departments, also contractors, working with, at the district level, the national level, working with to try to build up this capacity. But that's also, now we're going to see a winding down of that. Particularly in areas of governance, law enforcement, rural development. The third surge, which I said is in full swing, is the invigorated diplomatic approach, reconciliation, and along with that, the regional approach, a mustering of international cooperation. All with the idea of how can you, in a post-2014, maintain economic growth and stability. Now, on the reconciliation side, I have to mention also that two components there, the reconciliation and the reintegration. One of them the grand bargain, the other a much more incremental process in which you have is lots of political settlements. And let me come back to that in just a moment. Here, also a goal out there to maintain at least as much as possible the framework of democracy. And this is where the elections come in. And so, question here of that there be elections, and that of course means external funding. Without external funding, virtually all of the Afghan government's yearly income would pay for a national election. So it would barely cover the costs. Now let me mention here that whatever this is, ultimately the success of the transition lies with the Afghans themselves. Failings in governance in the absence of inclusive politics complicate any kind of transition. The United States has not been very successful in influencing Pakistan's domestic politics, certainly not electoral politics, where we made sometimes, I believe, not a sufficiently vigorous effort to keep them from adopting an electoral system, which in anybody's estimation had to be a disaster. And it's proven itself beautifully in terms of a system which fragmented political responsibility and makes all the same mistakes that existed in the experiment in democracy from 1965 to 73. In the absence of functioning political parties and the idea that you can have a parliament, that you can build majorities without political parties. The only way to explain that is President Karzai's desire to have a fragmented parliament in the initial misapprehension that if it were fragmented, he could then mold majorities, he could then create majorities, and he wouldn't have an opposition to face. Well, on the reconciliation track, let me take a few moments. Mooney and I have some differences here. Let me explain why that's so. The idea here was to explore an early conclusion to the conflict and who would be against that, who would be close-minded and not want to see if there's an opportunity here. Until very recently, there have never really been strong peace feelers from the Afghans. We have been pushing. They have not pushed at all. And until 2010, there was no reason to expect that they would. They were steady. The momentum clearly was with the Taliban. Nobody expected, nobody had it. But what changed is once we decided we were on our way out, then you start thinking about what does it look like when we're out. And then it looks a little bit different, as it does too once you've, if not regained the momentum with the military surge, at least you've arrested the momentum. And the idea which then said, then there is what is the necessary feature for a political agreement, and that is a herding compromise. You don't get a political agreement. You get it either because one side is winning and the other side is losing, or because what you have is a herding stalemate. Well, of course, none of those things apply. But something else, the weariness on the part of the American public. This is the longest war the U.S. has fought. Our own economic problems, you're aware of what I'm talking about. But what's going on in Europe as well, and the British and the Germans pushing much harder because their publics have been even more vocal in opposition to the war, whereas the United States, it's been a much more gradual process. And President Karzai was on board. Why was he on board? And if you look at the timing, at the time when he first got interested in pressing this and was talking about the Taliban as his brothers, is when the pressure was on for corruption, doing something about corruption. It changed the agenda. It changed the agenda. And also it's in the aftermath of questionable legitimacy of the 2009 election. It was a distraction from those two things and worked very successfully. Now it became all about, when Afghans came to Washington, it became all about this peace. And suddenly all of the pressure for corruption, dealing with corruption, disappeared. Now the United States initially was cautious, even cynical about the possibilities when it was first broached, and refrained largely from the notion that, look, if we take an opposition to it, and then it doesn't go anywhere, we're going to get blamed. So, you know, let's not. That changed, forget about sit down. That changed when Holbrooke died. Before that point, what had happened was there was when we were dealing with Afghanistan, it was about what we called a strategic dialogue. And it was about working out partnership between ministries and so on. That was what consumed Holbrooke, together with the idea of the regional approach. That was also his strong baby. But reconciliation of the kind now is not Holbrooke. That came when the Special Representative Mark Grossman comes on the scene, and then this becomes then what the United States becomes ultimately dedicated to this, the twin reconciliation and the regional. Okay, there developed then a strong difference between the State Department and the civilians. The position of the military was, we're not against it. We really believe that reconciliation, or integration rather, is the route. We're not against it, but the time is not right. And you can get this when, in fact, we're doing it clearly from a position of strength. We're not there yet. This was the military, and remains the military viewpoint, whereas the civilian viewpoint is, no, there is this opportunity which we've got to grasp. We also had as part of this that it should be Afghan-led. That's come into question certainly very recently as to whether in our anxiousness to get something going, what we've sold Karzai on, the idea is, well, it's not Afghan-led now, but if you wait around and we get going, it'll be Afghan-led. So he's on board for the moment on that. Let me move quickly here. As far as I'm concerned, and those who I share my views here, the Taliban have very little interest in any kind of compromise. There has not been any kind of serious discussion which has gone beyond talking about talking. There has been no substantive discussion about what would really constitute this. Because President Karzai has said that it involves disarmament, it involves basic principles of the Constitution, agreement to join the political process. The idea that this is a shortcut, and I know once in a while Moody says, you know, we act quickly here. I'm not worried about that because these kinds of agreements, when you know what the end is like, and we know what it should look like in Kashmir, we know what it should look like in the Palestinian-Israeli. Everybody can tell you we just can't get there. We don't know what the end is like here. We don't know what the shape of it is. And we don't even know who we're negotiating with. So what we're talking about here is a process which doesn't go on weeks or months, but goes on years. And is a perfect recipe for stringing something out. The idea that Mullah Omar and company want to settle for cabinet positions. This ministry, that provincial governor, this is not the Taliban. We negotiated with the Taliban in the late 90s. I was at the periphery of it. And I saw what happened. There was nothing. There was nothing. They weren't interested in that at all. Right now, the idea that what I'm getting at is that their view here is not as Pashtun nationalists. They have an Islamic agenda, and it's not an integrative. It's not a inclusive agenda. Yes, they talk about ethnic groups, but they did that in the 90s. If you listen to what they said in the 90s, they said that what we stand for transcends ethnicity. They never declared themselves a Pashtun group. And they're still true on that, because Islam does transcend. Everyone says there's a political solution here. Everyone that is, I'm sorry, that there's no military solution. And therefore has to be a political solution. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a political solution. There are other outcomes here as well. But it seems to me the only people who have not yet come around to that there cannot be a military solution is the Taliban. I don't want to talk about the regional track. I could spend time on that. I agree with, it's really been covered by Hasid very well. It was all built around the idea, which hasn't been mentioned, of the new Silk Road, because the strong component here is to be the economic component. That's the really strong component. And it's the idea that they buy in because it's in everybody's economic interest to do so, except it's true. None of the countries of the region would be better off with the Taliban regime. But they don't believe in that outcome. So right now everybody's got another policy, an insurance policy, which is a contingency on the fact that that's not going to happen. What happened at Bonn only showed that people are still jockeying for what their position is going to be post 2014. There was nothing at Bonn, and this is what Karzai wanted, there was nothing at Bonn, which, I'm sorry, but it is in Istanbul, which talked about terrorist sanctuaries, which talked about Pakistan's role here. There was nothing. What you had here was a long list of principles and projects for Afghanistan, and the Russians and the Chinese and others said, but Shanghai Cooperation Organization is already doing that. ECO can do that. SARC can do that. What we wanted was and still would like to have, is a regional forum which also accepts our notion about a strategic place. But these are not military compatible. Can you have a military presence there and at the same time tell everybody else that somehow nobody should take advantage? There should be non-interference. Maybe there is compatible, I don't know. The financial implications I can't begin to go into, but the idea is that it is going to be difficult, it is going to be painful. There's no question about that. The major, we actually have until the 1:45 for our discussion. Do I have that correct? Well, I'm looking here. Look, I've come 8,000 miles. You can give me another 5 minutes. Our strategy here is that, okay, we are winding down, let's let's admit to that. We are winding down. But if we make the right kind of investment, we can manage that. And what we're now talking about is a foundational investment. Get away from the short-term handout projects and go to those which do build the capacity in governance, in human resource growth, in economic growth generally. This is the approach, and it's in the paper. The paper has two concluding sections. One is on alternative scenarios, and I've got 4 of them. And the first, and I won't go into the details, but I can spell out here what the components of each one of these would likely be. But the first one is a transition which exceeds expectations, and the U.S. maintains a strong engagement. And it's a little fanciful, I know, but it's all of the scenarios, I would argue, are plausible. Some are more probable, but they're all plausible. And if things went exactly as we would hope they would go, I think this first scenario, which I've talked about here, would be, I think, what it would look like. The second is the transition is good enough. That's the second transition. And that is the U.S. in a phased withdrawal. It involves, yes, we have a strategic agreement, and the management of the security is pretty much not what we want it to be, but good enough. Again, it's all spelled out. The transition breaks down as the third scenario. The U.S. accelerates its disengagement. We run short of our goals, and that's there. And then the fourth is where the transition is overtaken by events. Anything from the fact that Karzai's not around at the end of 2014 to, yes, emergency rule, which is not inconceivable if things, depending on how things go. But a breakdown in relations between the United States and Pakistan. All of these things that I spell out here would all have also, including an agreement with the Taliban. All of them would change things. An agreement with the Taliban, where the international community still had a presence, is impossible for me to conceive, because that's their bottom line. Our bottom line is Al-Qaeda. Their bottom line is the foreign troops are gone. And then finally, I have a set of 9 recommendations. I would have liked 10, but I only had 9. 10 is usually the number, and one of them involves, of course, is that we not opt for such a large security force, that we bring that 352 down to a more manageable number. But I have a number of other rather specific things that we can do. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much. I think we had an excellent presentation, different perspectives. Some of them moving parallel, some not that parallel. We have over 25 minutes. Post-lunch, just before coffee break, but I think this is an extremely exciting session. Not only that, what are we in for Afghanistan as far as the future is concerned? I'd like to open the floor for questions, comments. Please keep the questions and comments short, and please identify yourself. Yes, my friend.
Okay, I'm Xuecheng Liu. I'm just a simple blogger. I've said this a few times already. Okay, 2 to 3 just short points. Afghanistan is now part of SARC. So there's a question, is there a possibility that SARC will evolve into something other than just an economic bloc of South Asian countries, where the biggest country in the SARC bloc is, of course, India. India takes it upon itself to get Pakistan, where relationships between India and Pakistan have been improving, and say, sister Pakistan and sister Afghanistan, come on, sit down, sort out your differences, all right? The second point is, will we ever see a scenario where it gets to a stage where all the major powers in the region say, let's form something along the lines of, like the six-party talks with North Korea, where everybody knows that they don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. The third point is the one area where the US and Iran could have agreed on was Afghanistan. The first time it was, according to Mearsheimer and Walt, the Iranian regime did help the American regime with intelligence to get rid of the Taliban. Then you had a stage where the Bush regime didn't want to talk to Iran. Then Iran now has Ahmadinejad, who doesn't want to talk to America. Will we see a situation where either the current administration or the new administration says, okay, let's not worry about the Gulf, Arab Gulf, and let's now focus on Iran and Afghanistan and sit down with Iran? And will that ever happen?
Okay, thank you. I will take one more question and then
my question is that, with the term of reference, particularly with regard to Prof. Mohammed, for example, you get to the point that the known and the known unknown. The question, I think, it is in fact across the board. The question is that before you ask, Afghanistan, in fact, the whole government, Pakistan, China, India, even America, is in transition for the next government. Now the question is that at home, in-house, you guys are still not certain. Now, I don't think that the reflection, and expectation, particularly when you say it's a personal dimension rather than a national dimension, you make it even worse and make it even more governed. So to grapple with that, you can't be business as usual, because expect the unexpected. Expect the unexpected, you say that, look, when Richard Holbrooke left, passed away, there's a complete change in American policy. Yes. And I could see that, the question is that, it looks to me that, for example, that you say that, the demo and, Rex in America, it is a policy of whether consideration over insensitivity, and a question of charity over charity. It's a world apart. And if the Americans' animals turn around to become, the donkey and the elephant situation, we can expect even worse. So the question is that it's a different scenario. The Indian dimension is suppose the Congress is not in office. So what happened? China, what happened if, things turn around? And you cannot discount it, the Xinjiang factor. And so is Pakistan, because the Kashmir dimension cannot be discounted. And the whole thing, the Palestinian issue, the Iranians, Strait of Hormuz and so on, cannot be discounted because, for convenience sake. Because you know why?
Let us answer your question.
Okay, we'll start with Prof. Mani.
On SARC, in fact, SARC has the potential to address this question very, very seriously on two counts. One is the economic cooperation, where Afghanistan is a part of it, and the second is terrorism. On both of them, there is a consensus, there is a written consensus. The question is of translating that consensus in practice and policy. The problem arises that all the countries, including Pakistan, including India, including Afghanistan, have committed not to shelter or give sanctuaries to the terrorists from other countries in their territory. But on the ground, this is not the reality. Economically, if Afghanistan, Pakistan and India were to cooperate, a great deal of economic problems of Afghanistan and also other countries can be addressed. The question is that Indian goods have no transit via Pakistan to Afghanistan. Afghan goods have now been allowed a transit via Karachi, but not much is taking place about it. Now the whole idea was of a regional grouping working on economic cooperation. And if it is allowed to work, I think SAARC will not resolve the problem. This is not a panacea of the regional problems, but can greatly help in mitigating the kind of problems which they have. One half a point, and that is coming back to Weinbaum, when he said he disagreed with my reconciliation fast. I'm saying this is what the countries are worried about, that if you have a quick deal and get out of it. And why are countries worried about? Countries are worried about because of the US past record. I mean, you left Afghanistan in lurch in the beginning. The way you have left Iraq, it hasn't given comfort to many other countries. And in the recent times, there are two critical statements. Hillary Clinton and the latest is Vice President, who says Taliban are not our enemy. This is coming from your Vice President, that this Taliban group, after Al-Qaeda has been, is not your enemy. Now what kind of ripples it will throw to other countries? I'm just raising this question. I'm not saying that I'm convinced that you will have a quick deal and get out of it. I'm not saying it, but the countries are worried about it. And I think unless these worries and concerns are properly addressed, there is no way getting out of it. The Qatar negotiations, the way they are going on, there are several other indications which have come up in the recent times, which are really disturbing.
I agree entirely. I'm worried about it. Now the Vice President always did have a different angle. Remember, he wanted to get out. He wants to get out a lot sooner. But he was put in his place once Obama made his decision. But what he has wanted is an offshore approach, where what you do is you have American forces hold up in some major cities, and you use air power. Utterly ridiculous idea, that somehow this was going to salvage the country. Let me say something about Iran, because it's very true. Everybody knows that Iran was critical in the Bonn meeting in 2001. You needed Iran, you needed the Russians, and so on, to bring everybody on board. They played a very important role. Iran's role since then has gotten caught up, obviously, in American-Iranian relations, and Iran has played a double game. On one hand, it does want to see a stable government in Kabul. It's an advantage. Iran is making enormous economic gains and has had a tremendous influence in the culture of the western part of the country, so that its influence generally in the country has grown over these years. At the same time, they don't want to see the United States around on any permanent basis, particularly in Shandong, the air base in the western part of the country. And so they've actually been, in a minor way perhaps, but not unimportantly, for symbols, they've helped the Taliban too, to bleed the United States. So it's a complicated situation that the Taliban, that Iran, playing a very strange game here. But ultimately, it hinges on relations. And Mooney made a very important point, which I hadn't thought about, and that is that if things break down, their capacity here to create a Hezbollah-like group, which would operate against American forces, is perhaps very real.
It's not only a question of Vice President being on a different...
No, I know that.
Hillary Clinton made a statement saying, dropping down the conditions earlier, that we will talk to them only when they accept Constitution, they abjure violence. Now she says she has revised it and said, no, these were not the conditions, these were the outcomes we were thinking about it. So there is a certain change which is taking place, and that's what which is causing worries. So far as Taliban are concerned, I don't know who speaks for Taliban. Is it Mullah Omar who speaks for Taliban? Is it Islamabad which speaks for Taliban? Is it Haqqani who speaks for Taliban? Who speaks for them? Therefore, even when you start a process of negotiations, who are you negotiating with? What is the kind of authority? I mean, this is the kind of a confusion. And still they are willing to open an office in Qatar with the blessings of the US. And then start negotiations with them. These are the
Moody,
things
we're exactly on the same page.
I know, which create confusion and concerns amongst other countries.
Yeah, thank you. Hasan.
Just briefly on the Taliban/reconciliation discussion, Marvin put it out very well that it has evolved since Ambassador Grossman's appointment, and there is an energetic effort to try to get some sort of a deal with them. Out in Kabul and around the country, what we question is a deal both as named by Professor Mooney, with whom at what price? And at what price is more crucial to us? Because previously, many people in the country, in fact, Minister Stonex is here, and I think he will recognize the fact that the government had failed to build consensus around the discussion of both reconciliation and reintegration. And the whole Jirga and other things did not manage to quell concerns, or at least address some of those concerns. Eventually, at the Afghan side, we did have some level of control over what accommodation the government may eventually offer the Taliban or what they may not. But now the concern has been raised to a whole different level. Now, essentially, Afghanistan, the way we perceive it, is pretty much off the table. We don't even, I could be corrected by Minister Stonex, but I don't know if we even have a seat now. It's the Taliban, the US, and specifically Ambassador Grossman's office, and perhaps that can't be achieved without some level of Pakistan cooperation or sanctioning. Previously, what we've seen is that each time there is a channel open to talks with elements within the Taliban or the so-called insurgency, where it has gone outside the purview or outside the permission level of Pakistan, they've interfered. We had the case of Mullah Baradar. So if the Taliban are now openly declaring a presence in Qatar, and then there's an engagement coming up with them, that begs the question of to what level is Pakistan involved in this process. And I think both the public in Afghanistan, regional actors, as well as the government, even in Afghanistan, may want to get some clarity on it. But more overall, in terms of our placement in the region and how we can place ourselves looking beyond 2014 and during the transformation decade, if you will, there is a slow but gradually evolving thinking in Kabul that now that we have that both the international community, regional actors, and others have realized that certain countries use radicalism and extremism as a source of as an instrument of policy, that now that problem has been identified, we on the Afghan side must need to focus on things where we build safeguards against those things. We've tried a great deal over the past couple of years to try to get certain countries, certain governments to change policies or change instruments of their influence, if you will. Hasn't yielded much. Now I think, again, that thinking in Kabul is slowly coming up that we need to build some level of absorbing capacity, perhaps even ignore the threats that certain people in the region are brewing towards us, and eventually maybe that ignoring will help alter their policies, because bringing attention or seeking some level of, if you will, cooperation did not get us anywhere.
Thank you. Dr. Liu?
Just several words on that. Really, in June last year, we had a discussion at the working level preparing for Istanbul conference and Bern conferences, discussed the regional cooperation. Really, that's why I talked about this in my presentation. It is very difficult without Afghanistan's leading role. Any regional cooperation it cannot be achieved. Why? Because the different strategic conflicts here. That means if the United States want to take the lead, how can Iran participate in this process? Cannot. Without Iran's participation, how can you stabilize the situation in the western part of these countries? And Pakistan probably the same. If the relationship between Pakistan and the United States cannot improve, is not constructive and cooperative, how can you stabilize the situation in Afghanistan? So only Afghanistan itself, its leadership, its government, initiated its own agenda, work with the different neighbors, then create such an overlapped bilateral cooperation and with Afghanistan at the core, at the center, then maybe this is a practical, pragmatic approach can be functioning. This is one point. The second point, what is six-party force? We talked about 8, we talked about 10, but more and more participant parties want to get in. Neighbor, talk about neighbors. Who are the neighbors? US is neighbor? No. Turkey is neighbor? No. Russia is neighbor? No. China is neighbor. How many neighbors should be interested? Only Afghanistan itself, its government, can identify the partners to work with. This is my view, and this is the conclusion we discussed in on the desert, really, on the desert in summer. So anyway, this is our conclusion, inconclusive document submitted to several conferences and phone conferences. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca Hubble. I'm here from the State Department based in Washington, D.C. Thank you all. And just to step back for a moment, I want to thank ISAS and others for bringing together such a great group of speakers. This has been wonderful for me to be able to listen in on all of these discussions. I'm heading off to Kabul for a couple of weeks, and so I'm looking forward to taking some of these messages back to embassy and others there. There's a whole lot I could talk about here. I'm not here to respond to all of the points, and I'm hoping that Minister Sanaksad can respond to some of the other issues as well that have been raised. We haven't talked a lot about the security transition, the security aspect of transition, and how that could or could not be sort of aligned or linked up to the reconciliation process. We are talking a lot about 2014 and beyond, but there are a good 2 years by my mathematics right now, just under 2 years until we hit 2014. And I'm wondering what you all could think are possibilities in terms of leveraging the security transition process, i.e. Janet-led transition to Afghan security forces lead and the different tranches. We've already been through 2 tranches, but there are, I believe, 2 or 3 more to go, and some potential wiggle room there in terms of the timing and the nature of those decisions. And then, obviously, against the backdrop of the decisions on the U.S. troop withdrawal as well. So I'm wondering if anyone would have any thoughts on that as it relates to the political discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question? Okay, we answer that one first. Yes, please.
I think that's it's a key question that needs to be raised, and I think Marvin mentioned this rightly, that there are certain people in both Afghanistan, the US, and elsewhere who question the timing of this thing called the political process, especially its alignment with the security shifts, both when it comes to anti-insurgency activities as well as this transition with the Afghan forces coming in and that is taking over. That really begs the question of when in fact there are questions about the capability, equipment, as well as command and control of Afghan forces, their capability to stand when they are not fully supported by international actors. When such a scenario is looming, when that in many provinces, let's take for example the example of Lahore and elsewhere, why would a local insurgent unit have any incentive to reconcile or reintegrate? Because in such a scenario, what you get again is that you allow them much more leverage, you give them much more of a sense that they will now be able to dominate much more than they used to. So it is a critical question. I do have serious concerns about it. Another problem with the way these lots of transitions are being announced with provincial level, certain provinces named one after the other. I don't quite understand the criteria, and in some cases much of it, honestly put, because it's an academic setting, is all for the rhetoric reason. Bamyan was transitioned, honestly put, there wasn't much transition there, and that was that. So you have, what that leads to all of a sudden is the phenomena that you do create targets that are not that well protected, and each time the insurgents strike, They do hit the headline saying they hit the province that was either handed over to the Afghan forces or a province that was not well protected. They did try that in Bamyan. We have seen, at least in 2 areas in Bamyan since transition, and security has deteriorated. So those are again the concern that there ought to be some synergy between security gains, security transfer, and political process, and that synergy is absolutely missing right now. You have tracks completely divorced from each other. The State Department, specifically the Grossman office, I don't quite understand if it's very in sync with what may be happening down in Kabul by General Allen or even out of CENTCOM.
Yeah. Okay, a minute there, a minute here, and then we wrap it up.
Look, I think that the path we're on now puts at risk our security and service. It raises questions here about the kind of planning that we have in place. If negotiations were to go anywhere, one of the demands of the Taliban would be to have a place in the Afghan security forces. The relationship between the Taliban forces and the Afghan security forces, this would become a major stumbling block ultimately. But how can you talk about, how can we talk about what that looks like? Because until we know what the shape of that negotiation is like. For example, it's very possible that as the negotiations were to proceed, even if they didn't reach a conclusion, a satisfactory conclusion, that might be enough to create the tensions within the Afghan ANA right now, which could see a beginning of a disintegration of that. And the real concern here is that it begins to break up, and elements, particularly since the North dominates so much of the ANA, then really find their attraction in the various warlords. Well, what I'm saying here is that a civil war in the future is not going to look like the 90s. It's not going to look like the 90s. It's going to be much more fragmented. There is no Massoud. There is no Massoud. I want to hear what you have to say. So I'm really concerned here about the cohesion of the ANA, depending on how that reconciliation goes. I think we know that there has been a substantial rearmament among elements in the North, and that they have a capability here which, despite the earlier disarmament process, has grown. So I guess what I'm ultimately saying is, until we know whether this process has legs or not, it's going to be very hard to evaluate what its effect is going to be here. Let me make one last thing. What I'm arguing for here, and it's one of my recommendations, is Afghanistan has to be a non-aligned country. Call it a neutral country if you want, but not the old neutral country of the buffer state, where it was a victim of other forces, but the kind of situation where it is a neutrality which is Afghan-led, because Afghanistan plays a central role in the security of the entire region, and that's been stressed here. And so, but that ultimately, the survival of Afghanistan depends on that, because it does have predatory neighbors. And that is what it's going to have to, figure out a way to live with those neighbors, and I believe it can do so only by not allowing, obviously, others to take advantage of their position in Afghanistan to attack a third country, and certainly not to give advantages to outside forces.
Thank you.
The deterioration in security situation looks to my mind inevitable. Why it looks inevitable? Because the whole question of withdrawal has actually encouraged, and as he said, as Marvin said very rightly, that it's a kind of a sense of victory amongst the Taliban that your US has decided to withdraw. Now, as your first, second and third tranches start withdrawing, I suspect there would be more and more attacks, also in Afghanistan and also on US forces. I mean, look at the indication of this last agreement between the TTP and the Quetta Shura, in which they said, the message is very clear. I don't know who is behind this agreement. One can guess it. The message is very clear. Don't attack Pakistani forces. Attack US. That's right. And if this is the message, I think the security situation would deteriorate. Now, if you want to stop this security situation, I think you have the answer. The problem is that the US does not have the willpower and probably capacity to do that. You know where the sanctuaries of these people are. You know where they are sitting. Kabul has been egging on you time and again that, look, this is the target. The terrorism is not here, terrorism is here. And you have been respecting the Doran line, which the terrorists don't respect. This is where the problem is. And if you are going to live with this kind of a hang-up, that look, we want this and we want that and not like this and not like that, you will have a significant deterioration in the security situation, both for Afghanistan as also for the US forces.
Yeah, we started 10 minutes late. I'll take one last question. A short one, or a minute.
If you allow me, it's a piece of comment, not a question.
Right, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. On the transition, I think transition for Afghans is basically a need, it's not an option. And it has to go not only for military transition or security transition, it has to go along with good governance, development, as well as providing or delivering justice. It will not be sustainable if we put one flag up and the other one down, because it's not a matter of just symbols and flags. When it comes to the army, I think comparing to the other forces inside Afghanistan, Afghanistan army is one of the trustable army, I could say, among other security forces. The concern for us, when it comes in terms of training, in terms of professionalism, and in terms of taking responsibility, when there is a serious operation, and they're taking the lead, even on the nitrate. Out of 7 people that participate in the nitrate, 5 are Afghans, 2 are foreigners, and the US people, and they are mentors. I have seen the night operation demonstration myself in Bagram airport, and I think Afghans are taking lead, and I think it will not be a fair judgment towards Afghan force, especially army, if we, comparing the capacity others have. The concern we have is basically the police and ANS, and this is something that we need to properly invest. The ALP that is, I think, an American initiative, creates a lot of concerns in Afghanistan, especially with transition happen. The ALP are accused of human rights violation. They are ex-warlords and people who have a background of criminal background. We gave them weapons, and basically without any regular monitoring and a process to disarm them back. This is a matter of rearming Afghanistan. If you allow me a small comment on the regional thing, I know I have a chance to speak on that. Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship is at a very critical moment of itself. For many reasons, and I think with the West, with the United States as well. First, because of the fact that Afghanistan has been claiming that we are a victim of terrorism. It's not a nation that produces terrorism, and I think Osama bin Laden murder just proved the claim. Second, back-to-back attacks by Haqqani groups in Kabul, and especially in the US Embassy and NATO, and the response we give from Taliban, and I agree with you, sir, Professor Muni, that we don't know which function of Taliban or which part of Taliban. The response we get in our peace message is horrible, and it's getting horrible day by day. I think it's a time for us. I will buy President Karzai's statement on this, but there is a difference. Right after Professor Rabbani assassination, President Karzai went to the media the next day and said, I want to talk to Pakistan now. I will stop talking to the Taliban. I think I will buy his piece here, but the difference is that talks with Pakistan with an international guarantee to ensure that Pakistan actually, both Afghanistan and Pakistan respect the mutual interest of the two countries. And I'm sure Pakistani friends understand that it's only in the best interest of Afghanistan and Pakistan to respect each other's interests.
Thank you very much. Last point.
It's a quick one, actually. The challenge my former boss on something here. Marvin, this discussion of elements in the north or in the center of the country arming is a bit hyped by the media. Well, the greater risk, in fact, by any rash deal or any rash settlement, if you will, with the Taliban is in geographies in the east and in the north and the south as well, because most conflicts inevitably are very local. And if any deal between the United States and the Taliban allows the Taliban uncontested access to safe places in Uruzgan or in Helmand, we can safely bet on the fact that there will be local conflicts and there will be a cycle of revenge as we saw in post-2001. That's the greater risk. The north and elsewhere, yes, there is, and in Kabul specifically, if you want, there is a greater concern about what a deal with Taliban would lead. Some people have phrased it as saying that nobody wants the borders of North Waziristan to extend all the way to the borders of Kabul, essentially capturing the sense that you will have areas free floating for terrorists and extremists all the way to gates of Kabul. That's been said, but overall the risk is across the board all over the country, not just the north center or southeast or southwest.
Okay, final word.
Just a 2 minutes. Really, we have discussed this is a very critical questions raised by that name. That means we have two transitions. One transition is short period, 2 years. Another transition is beyond 2019. We understand that the agenda, the deadline of U.S. military withdrawal is not meet the agenda of national of this national transition, Afghanistan transition, but meet the agenda of American presidential election. This is very clear. So the problem, Afghanistan is not well prepared for their responsibility, and the United States cannot afford to bear its responsibility to defend this country or to safeguarding the security of this country during this period. With the reduction of U.S. military presence, certainly the tensions is growing. So that's why we recommend that we should take UN as to come and take the leading role from the supporting role. So during this period, as Ms. Kufi just talked about, not just the military, not just the defense, we have national reconstruction, economic reconstruction, social reconstruction. Here, only UN can play such a role. That's all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, sorry for extending a lot of time, but I thought it would be very, very unjust to stop it because we did not take our eyes off this panel after lunch. So please join me to thank the panel.
Thank you, speakers, for an invigorated discussion. I would like to invite Professor Bilveer Singh to present tokens of appreciation to our speakers. Professor Marvin Weinbaum, Dr. Liu. Professor Marvin Weinbaum. Mr. Hasif Umayr will receive the gift on behalf of Mr. Haroun Mir. I would like to request Professor S.D. Mooney, visiting research professor of ISAS, to present a token of appreciation to Professor Bilveer Singh.
Thank you. I get nothing in the truth.
Now I would like to invite everyone to a tea reception just outside the function room. Please be back at 3:30 p.m. Thank you.